In the summer of 1987, deep in the hills of Kentucky, a discovery was made that still defies science and unsettles the imagination. Behind the rotting boards of an abandoned farmhouse lay the culmination of over a century of secrecy, devotion, and genetic collapse. Locals whispered of God's punishment. Doctors called it impossible. And yet there it was, a child, if you could still call it that. What happens when a family locks itself away for generations, convinced that purity is power? What happens when bloodlines are folded in on themselves until nature finally rebels? This is not just a tale of poverty or of old-world superstition. This is the story of the Holloways, the family that blurred the line between human and something else entirely. A story long buried, scrubbed from records, yet still lingering in the shadows of Appalachia. Tonight, we unearth it. Before we dive into this chilling story, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy unraveling forgotten histories and unsettling mysteries. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. The summer air of 1987 in rural Kentucky carried a thickness that clung to every breath. On Holloway Ridge Road, silence stretched heavy, broken only by the occasional hum of insects hidden in the trees. At 3:47 a.m., a call reached the Breathitt County authorities. Neighbors had reported strange cries echoing from the old Holloway farmhouse. Some said it was a baby. Others swore the sound wasn't human at all. Margaret Thornfield, a seasoned social worker hardened by 12 years of rural poverty cases, agreed to accompany deputies on this midnight visit. She had seen neglect, malnutrition, despair, but nothing that prepared her for what awaited. The farmhouse itself loomed like a decaying relic. Once white, its paint had long since peeled into ragged flakes, revealing wood eaten by rot. Windows were shuttered with mismatched planks, as though the house itself resisted intrusion. The sheriff's deputies had already tried twice before. Both times, their knocks went unanswered. But neighbors kept reporting the same sounds, wailing, keening, and cries that ended in guttural tones no infant should ever produce. This third time, Margaret insisted on going inside. With her flashlight gripped tightly, she followed the officers as they forced open the door. A sickly, sweet stench hit her instantly, making her gag involuntarily. The beam cut across shadowed walls coated in grime. Sheets hung like curtains, creating a claustrophobic maze of hidden corners and narrow passageways. Each step creaked beneath their weight, as though the very floor resented their trespass. From deeper within came that sound, part moan, part cry, a cadence that didn't belong to any known creature. Margaret's skin prickled. Every instinct told her to leave, yet her duty forced her onward. They moved carefully, stepping past overturned furniture, piles of unwashed clothing, and jars filled with cloudy liquid whose contents were best left unquestioned. The smell worsened the deeper they pressed into that labyrinth of decay. At last, Margaret's flashlight revealed a small room at the end of a narrow corridor. There, half hidden by a sagging curtain, stood a crib. The cries now trembled just beyond comprehension. Margaret hesitated, her hand trembling on the curtain. She'd encountered countless children in need, but something about this moment filled her with dread, an instinctual warning, as though whatever lay ahead would change her forever. When she finally swept the beam across the crib, the deputies gasped audibly. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she couldn't tell if she was staring at a child or at something altogether different. The figure inside twitched with irregular movements, limbs shifting in angles that seemed anatomically impossible. Its head was too large, elongated in strange proportions, and its eyes, too many, too alert, flickered independently across the dim room. Silence fell heavy. The cries ceased the instant the flashlight touched the figure, as though it were aware of their presence. Its gaze, fragmented yet focused, seemed to study them with a chilling alien intelligence. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Every part of her training told her to classify what she saw as human, to protect it. Yet her mind screamed otherwise, struggling to fit this image into anything familiar. The parents emerged from the shadows then, Elijah and Sarah Holloway. Their twisted frames bore the unmistakable mark of generations of inbreeding, their features so distorted it was impossible to guess their true ages. They stood silently, devotion etched across their faces, as if presenting their child to the intruders. There was no fear in their eyes, only a fierce reverence, as though they guarded something sacred. Margaret lowered her flashlight, realizing the cries that had terrified neighbors weren't cries of suffering at all. They were calls, expressions of something beyond pain or comfort. She understood then. This was no ordinary discovery. And in that moment, deep in the forgotten farmhouse, Margaret Thornfield knew the world outside would never be ready to see what had been born on Holloway Ridge. Some secrets, she realized, change everything once revealed. The story of the Holloways doesn't truly begin in 1987. To understand the terrible secret uncovered in that farmhouse, we have to travel back more than a century to the year 1847, deep in Appalachia. Ezekiel Holloway arrived in eastern Kentucky carrying little more than a mule, 2 women, and a vision. He was a man on the run, though the records remain silent about what he left behind. The women, Sarah and Rebecca, were sisters, bound to him with a devotion that seemed less like love and more like worship. Together they followed Ezekiel into the dense, unforgiving wilderness of Breathitt County. Ezekiel was no ordinary settler. While others sought survival, he sought something he called purity. In his journals, discovered years later, he wrote of a bloodline untouched, untainted, and chosen by God himself. He believed outside influence corrupted strength, that mingling with strangers weakened what he called the sacred thread of his lineage. To Ezekiel, the family itself wasn't just kin, it was a covenant, a holy duty. In that isolation, far from prying neighbors, Ezekiel laid down the first rules of what would become the Holloway doctrine. His children would never marry outsiders. Their blood would remain pure, unspoiled by contamination. What began as religious conviction quickly hardened into law. Daughters wed brothers, cousins wed cousins. Each new generation doubled down, twisting tighter into the belief that holiness and purity came only from within themselves. By the 1870s, their family tree no longer branched outward. It grew straight upward like a pole, looping back into itself. Outsiders would later compare it to a serpent swallowing its own tail. The early generations bore signs of strain. Babies with extra fingers or missing toes, children with hearing loss or mild learning difficulties. Yet the Holloways called these traits blessings, tokens of divine favor. Neighbors who lived near Holloway land whispered uneasily. The children spoke in strange tones, gestures punctuating guttural sounds outsiders couldn't understand. It was as though they were creating a language only their blood could decipher. By 1900, suspicion surrounded the family. Farmers working nearby claimed they heard eerie calls from the hills, half words, half wails, that sent shivers down their spines. Some crossed themselves whenever they passed Holloway property. Still, Ezekiel's descendants clung to his doctrine with unshakable fervor. For them, the world outside was diseased, corrupted by greed and sin. Only within their circle could true strength and purity survive, and Ezekiel's journal fed their resolve. One line, repeated often by his children, declared, "Our blood shall remain our blood, and our children shall know the strength that comes from purity." It became scripture. Those who dared challenge the Holloways found their words dismissed. Outsiders were treated as threats, tempters trying to lure them into betrayal. In time, the family withdrew completely, cutting ties with the world beyond. As their isolation deepened, so did the consequences. By the third generation, deformities no longer looked minor. Some children's joints bent the wrong way, their eyes shifted unnervingly. Yet still the family proclaimed holiness. From the outside, it looked like madness, but within the Holloway walls, it was righteousness. Every child, no matter how marked, was considered proof that Ezekiel's vision still guided their chosen bloodline. Thus, the stage was set. What Ezekiel began as a desperate attempt at purity had, within decades, turned into a self-perpetuating trap, one that each generation would fall deeper into, believing they were rising higher. And in that forgotten corner of Appalachia, a dark seed was planted, a seed that, over the next century, would grow into something no one, least of all Ezekiel, could have imagined. As generations passed, the Holloways' family structure collapsed inward, twisting like a vine, choking itself. Their doctrine left no room for outsiders. Cousins became spouses, siblings became partners, and the tree branched only into itself. What began as Ezekiel's strict command soon became an iron law. Children were raised knowing they would someday marry within. To refuse was betrayal, not just to family, but to God's chosen lineage. By the late 19th century, neighboring families watched with dread as the Holloways folded tighter. Their children looked different. Shoulders sloped unnaturally, limbs too short or too long, faces bearing uneven symmetry that unsettled even strangers' glances. Inside the Holloway circle, however, these were not flaws. They were marks of belonging, signs that their blood was unbroken. Elders preached that these gifts showed God's favor, proof their family was sacred above all. Whispers drifted through the hills. Farmers working nearby reported hearing strange cries, sounds too guttural, too warped to be mistaken for English. They weren't words, yet they carried a rhythm, almost like a language evolving in isolation. By the early 1900s, the Holloways had their own dialect. Outsiders described it as eerie, a blend of old Appalachian twang mixed with primal grunts, creating a tongue that felt more ancient than English itself. Even their gestures grew strange. They pointed, signed, and moved in ways others couldn't comprehend. Outsiders who glimpsed Holloway children playing said it felt less like watching kids and more like observing a secret ritual. The deformities, once mild, grew sharper each generation. Some were born with 6 fingers, others with fused digits. Eyes misaligned or wandering independently. A few children never learned to speak, yet communicated perfectly with kin. Despite this, the Holloways never faltered. Their gatherings rang with laughter, chants, and pride. To them, these marks weren't curses. They were living proof their blood was unbroken, carried pure through decades of devotion. By 1920, their separation from the outside world was nearly absolute. They farmed their own land, made their clothes, and avoided town altogether. Their world was entirely their own, untouched, impenetrable, and self-sustaining. To neighbors, though, they became figures of dread. Strange shadows darted at night. Calls echoed from the woods. Some swore they saw Holloway children climbing on all fours, darting like animals through moonlit trees. The family tree, once a symbol of legacy, now looked like something grotesque. Straight upward, no branches outward, its roots feeding only on themselves, creating patterns genealogists later admitted were too tangled to unravel. Each marriage pulled the bloodline tighter, every birth compounding what nature had already warned. And yet the Holloways clung to pride, telling themselves that purity was triumph, while others saw it as ruin. Their faith in blood became stronger than reason. They told stories of outsiders corrupted by greed, by sin, by sickness. Only they were untouched. Only they carried what Ezekiel promised: divine inheritance. But nature is stubborn. Over time, whispers became rumors. Rumors became warnings. By the 1930s, nearby families taught children never to wander close. Fear spread, a quiet acknowledgement that something unnatural was unfolding in those hills. Still, the Holloways pressed forward, blind to consequence. They believed themselves invincible, chosen, Untouchable. Every new child, no matter how unusual, was celebrated as another step toward eternal purity, another link in their sacred chain. The outside world drifted away, males stopped, neighbors vanished. By mid-century, the Holloways lived entirely alone, sealed within their own blood, spiraling deeper, generation after generation, into a fate no outsider dared to imagine. Inward they folded, like a mirror reflecting only itself, until the reflection warped beyond recognition. What Ezekiel began as purity had become something else entirely, an experiment in isolation that no longer resembled humanity at all. By the 1940s, rumors of the Holloways had spread beyond neighbors and farmers. Strange stories filtered into county offices, reaching doctors who were both curious and hesitant. Only one physician dared to step closer. Dr. Nathan Crenshaw was the county's only practicing physician at the time, a man accustomed to poverty, malnutrition, and rural sickness. Yet nothing in his years of work prepared him for Holloway Ridge. He was summoned after reports of a difficult birth. Expecting malnourished children, he instead found infants whose bodies appeared unfamiliar, misshapen skulls, limbs bent in unnatural ways, and eyes that drifted independently, refusing to focus together. The parents welcomed him without shame. To them, these children were blessed. They smiled as they explained that God had chosen their family to be different, to remain untouched while the rest of the world decayed. Crenshaw's notes, discovered decades later, spoke in unsettling detail. One child placed his hand on a lit stove and left it there, grinning as though no pain registered. Another bent his arm backward like a jointless hinge. He was disturbed not only by bodies, but by voices. The Holloway children spoke in guttural bursts, sounds that bypassed the throat. They understood one another effortlessly, yet to him it was indecipherable, almost animal-like. On subsequent visits, he noticed other disturbing patterns. Children crawling on all fours at startling speed, darting into shadows with unnatural grace. Their eyes glowed strangely in lamplight, tracking movements like predators rather than children. Neighbors had long whispered of shadows in the woods. Crenshaw confirmed those fears in his journals, writing that the Holloways' children seemed less like offspring of man and more like something in the process of becoming. The patriarch during those years was Josiah Holloway, Ezekiel's great-grandson. He had married his sister and fathered several children. When she died, he took his daughter as wife, sealing another loop in the family's twisted circle. The children born from this union carried even greater deformities. Some could not straighten their legs. Others bore faces stretched or compressed unnaturally. Still, the Holloways celebrated them, declaring each one proof of their sacred mission. Crenshaw's final visit occurred in 1945. By then, he was visibly shaken. In his private notes, he wrote, "They are crossing a biological threshold from which there is no return. I cannot continue." He refused further calls. Quietly, he told colleagues he feared what he had seen. He described the Holloways as existing outside medical understanding, as though evolution itself had turned sideways in those Appalachian hills. Other doctors avoided involvement entirely. Rural medicine was already stretched thin, and few were willing to risk stepping into a place spoken of in whispers, where patients stared too long and silence carried weight. Stories filtered back through towns regardless. Hunters claimed to see bent figures slipping through trees at night. Children were warned never to play near Holloway Ridge. Fear grew, mingling with fascination and disbelief. Crenshaw's journals, however, left little room for doubt. His descriptions were clinical, detailed, free of embellishment. They read less like folklore and more like a physician grappling with the collapse of his own scientific framework. What struck him most was not deformity alone, but intelligence behind it. He noted the Holloway children seemed aware of his fear, meeting his gaze knowingly, as though they understood truths he was incapable of grasping. By the time he abandoned them, the Holloways had moved beyond mere anomaly. They were becoming something the county doctor dared not name, something that made even science flinch, hiding behind silence rather than facing the impossible. In the end, Crenshaw left more questions than answers. His words lingered like shadows. What I witnessed in that house challenges not only medicine but humanity itself. And then, like the rest, he turned away. In 1952, a traveling preacher named Reverend Marcus Kane wandered into the isolated hollows of Kentucky, carrying only a Bible and conviction. He had heard whispers of a cursed family and felt called to intervene. Kane was a man of stubborn faith. Where others saw horror, he believed salvation lingered. He set out for Holloway Ridge with determination, convinced he could deliver light into the family's shrouded darkness. The Holloways, surprisingly, welcomed him. For 3 days he lived among them, eating their food, listening to their guttural conversations, watching the children play in ways that unsettled him more than he ever admitted aloud. In his diary, later discovered with pages water-damaged and smudged, Kane wrote of sounds, not tongues of angels, but of something far older. He confessed he felt as though he had stepped backward in human history. The children disturbed him most. He described them as moving like shadows across the floor, sometimes crawling with uncanny agility, other times standing upright but shifting oddly, as if their bones carried different instructions than his own. Their eyes haunted him. Kane wrote that their gaze was intelligent but alien, awareness that pierced deeper than human understanding. He felt examined, dissected even, as though the children saw truths he didn't want uncovered. Still, Kane prayed loudly, reading scripture each night. The Holloways listened politely, heads bowed. Yet their gestures and whispers suggested they weren't absorbing his words. They were simply indulging a visitor who would eventually leave. On his second night, he recorded hearing chanting from another room. Low, guttural harmonies rose in waves, blending into vibrations that rattled his chest. He confessed he couldn't sleep, his dreams plagued by warped faces. The third day brought clarity, or terror. Kane wrote of watching a child bend its body unnaturally, crawling swiftly across the ceiling beams with insect-like precision. He dropped his Bible, trembling as whispers echoed below. He described Sarah Holloway, the family matriarch, smiling faintly at his fear. Her face bore deformities so severe it was barely recognizable as human, yet her expression carried unmistakable pride in what her family had become. Kane attempted to baptize one of the children in a creek behind the farmhouse, but the child resisted, shrieking with such force that birds scattered from trees, and even the water seemed to ripple unnaturally. That night, Kane wrote of feeling watched by something beyond the family itself. He claimed shadows shifted across walls without cause, and the wind carried voices that whispered his name from unseen corners of the house. When he finally left, Kane staggered down Holloway Ridge, pale and broken. Locals said he preached only once more before abandoning ministry altogether, retreating into obscurity. His faith had not survived the Holloway encounter. The surviving fragments of his diary remain chilling. "These are not children as we know them," he scrawled. "They are both more and less. They move with purpose we cannot fathom. God help me." Scholars later examined the diary and dismissed parts as hysteria, the fevered ramblings of a man overwhelmed, yet locals insisted Kane was forever changed, eyes hollowed, haunted by visions he couldn't erase. His brief stay became legend. The preacher who sought to save the Holloways had instead fled from them, leaving behind only fragments of testimony, evidence of a family slipping further beyond redemption or recognition. Kane's words joined Crenshaw's notes in shaping the legend. The Holloways weren't just inbred, they were transforming. Each visitor confirmed it in terrified whispers. Yet still the family endured, hidden, growing stranger with each generation. 3 days were all Reverend Kane could withstand. But those 3 days etched an unshakable mark into folklore, a chilling reminder that sometimes faith meets something darker than sin, something older than salvation itself. After Reverend Cain's departure in 1952, the Holloways seemed to disappear entirely. For decades, their presence slipped from public view. No births registered, no deaths recorded, no medical visits logged. Officially, they ceased to exist. But absence didn't mean inactivity. Locals who lived near Holloway Ridge still whispered of movements in the night. Strange shapes flitted between trees. Eerie cries echoed across valleys, sounding both human and distinctly not. Mail carriers stopped climbing the ridge. Packages left at the base of the road rotted in place. Utility workers refused service calls. To outsiders, the Holloway property became a dead zone, avoided at all costs. The silence deepened. Decades without records suggested a vanishing act, but evidence of presence leaked through cracks. Farmers reported livestock disappearing mysteriously. Tracks, unlike any animals, crossed muddy fields, prints twisted, elongated, sometimes with too many toes. Hunters spoke of glimpses in the woods. Pale figures moving low to the ground, faster than human bodies should manage. Some swore the creatures flowed rather than stepped, bending strangely as though bones obeyed new laws. Even technology seemed disturbed by the ridge. Radios buzzed with static near Holloway property. Photographs developed with strange shadows, distortions that stretched faces unnaturally. Machines faltered, as though the land itself repelled intrusion. Neighbors told of voices carried by the wind, half laughter, half weeping, sometimes like songs sung at frequencies that left listeners nauseous. Entire families abandoned nearby homesteads, claiming dreams followed them long after leaving the area. The Holloway family tree by then had twisted into incomprehensible knots. Children born were simultaneously cousins, siblings, uncles, and nieces. Genealogists who tried mapping later admitted defeat, calling it a bloodline without direction or sense. Traditional categories like parent, child, husband, or wife blurred completely. In the Holloways' world, everyone was everyone else. Generations collapsed into themselves until lineage became a closed loop, an eternal cycle without distinction. Survival became increasingly mysterious. The family had long abandoned town, yet they persisted. Some believed they had reverted to primitive hunting and foraging. Others whispered darker theories, hinting at sustenance drawn from more forbidden sources. By the 1970s, Holloway Ridge was legend. Locals treated it like cursed ground. Children dared each other to approach the road but never crossed it. Adults refused even to glance toward the tree line, yet small signs remained undeniable. Smoke occasionally rose from chimneys. Figures were glimpsed briefly before vanishing into shadows. The land carried an aura of occupation, though official documents insisted it was abandoned long ago. The silence only intensified fear. Without contact, imagination filled the void. Stories grew of Holloway children with faces that rearranged themselves, voices that could mimic others, and eyes that glowed like lanterns in dark woods. Some swore the Holloways were no longer entirely human. Instead, they were evolving or devolving into something new, shaped by generations of inward turning. Whether this path was survival or collapse, no one dared investigate. And so, for 35 years, the Holloways remained ghosts in the hills. Unseen but never forgotten, their presence hung heavy like mist, impossible to prove, impossible to dismiss. Silence itself became their camouflage. The world beyond the ridge moved forward, cars, televisions, cities expanding. But on Holloway Ridge, time stood still. The family folded further inward, locked in a bubble no outsider could puncture. By 1987, that silence was broken. One call to authorities reignited the legend, forcing light into a place that had thrived in shadow. But for decades prior, The Holloways had lived entirely unseen. Their vanishing was never true disappearance. It was metamorphosis, a retreat into secrecy so complete it became myth, until the day when the myth opened its door and revealed something the world was unprepared to face. When Margaret Thornfield's flashlight finally cut through the gloom in 1987, it revealed not just a child, but the culmination of 140 years of genetic collapse sealed inside Holloway Ridge. The infant's body seemed sculpted from impossibility. Its skull elongated, spiraled inward unnaturally, and its limbs branched like tree boughs, carrying extra joints that bent in ways no human anatomy could reasonably allow. What arrested Margaret most were the eyes. 7 of them, arranged asymmetrically across its head, each one moving independently. They weren't cloudy like a newborn's. They focused sharply, tracking movement with chilling precision. The cries neighbors had reported weren't cries at all. In person, they resembled patterns, rhythmic keening closer to communication than distress. Margaret realized the sounds were purposeful, almost language-like, though no words took shape. Medical examiner Dr. Patricia Hensley arrived hours later. Her official report would later be sealed, but her private notes described the child as an organism that violates all known principles of heredity, yet remains undeniably alive. Hensley noted behavior that unsettled even seasoned staff. The infant turned toward sounds before they occurred. It reached for objects before they were visible, reacting to events seconds before they entered the physical world. The parents, Elijah and Sarah Holloway, stood proudly beside the crib. Their own features bore centuries of collapse, distorted jaws, asymmetrical faces, limbs slightly twisted. Yet their reverence for the infant was absolute, almost worshipful. They did not see deformity. They saw fulfillment. To them, this child was prophecy realized, the purest continuation of their sacred bloodline, something divine born from their sacrifice, no matter how grotesque outsiders judged it. Authorities were horrified. Deputies who had entered with Margaret later admitted they felt wronged by simply witnessing the child. Some claimed nightmares followed, dreams of rooms filled with cribs carrying things both familiar and alien. Within days, researchers from the University of Kentucky attempted DNA analysis. Results showed chromosomes folding back on themselves in recursive patterns, combinations so contradictory they should not have supported life. Yet the child thrived. Dr. Hensley's private conclusion was grim. "This is not a fluke," she wrote. "It is the inevitable end point of a lineage circling itself for too long. It should not exist, and yet it does." The infant responded to its parents differently than to outsiders. Observers noted it didn't recognize them as individuals, but as extensions of itself, components of a larger whole, as though boundaries of identity had dissolved. Even at rest, the child seemed alert. Its eyes darted independently, tracking unseen movements. Some present swore it stared into spaces empty to them, as if perceiving layers of reality hidden from ordinary sight. Local rumors spread faster than officials could contain. Whispers told of a child born with too many eyes, and a body twisted like roots. Some said it wasn't human, but something pretending to be. Margaret Thornfield, bound by confidentiality, carried the weight of that night in silence. To friends, she only hinted that some truths were too disturbing to share, secrets better buried than spoken aloud. Yet the image of the crib remained, haunting her until death. It was not just the body of the child that unsettled her. It was the sense that it knew more than anyone in the room. The Holloways' doctrine had finally borne fruit. Whether blessing or curse depended on perspective. To Elijah and Sarah, it was holy fulfillment. To outsiders, it was an abomination, a genetic endgame that should never have been reached. In that crib, the Holloway bloodline unveiled its ultimate expression. Not evolution, not exactly devolution, but something new entirely. An answer to Ezekiel's vow of purity, though twisted into a form no one could call human. News of the Holloway infant spread quickly, but not through newspapers or television. It traveled through whispered phone calls and frightened officials until, within 72 hours, federal agents descended on Breathitt County with startling precision. Their arrival was swift and clinical. Black sedans rolled down country roads before dawn. Unmarked trucks carrying equipment stopped outside the farmhouse. Locals who watched swore the government had known long before discovery. Margaret Thornfield was reassigned within days. A veteran social worker reduced overnight to a desk position in Lexington, she was forced to sign legal documents forbidding her from ever speaking of Holloway Ridge again. Dr. Patricia Hensley's original autopsy report vanished into sealed archives. In its place, a sanitized version appeared, describing severe genetic abnormalities consistent with inbreeding. The truth was erased, replaced with tidy scientific euphemism. Elijah and Sarah Holloway disappeared as though they'd never existed. No prison records, no hospital admissions, no graves. They were taken to what officials called a specialized care facility, but evidence ended there. The infant, too, vanished. One day it lay in the county morgue. The next it was gone. No death certificate, no transfer documents. Its existence was scrubbed as efficiently as its family's. Hospital staff who glimpsed the child before removal reported strange after-effects. Nurses confessed to recurring nightmares of rows of cribs filled with near-human figures. Security guards quit after watching distorted surveillance footage from the morgue. Locals noticed the Holloway farmhouse vanish almost overnight. Bulldozers arrived under the cover of darkness, flattening the structure. By sunrise, nothing remained but bare soil, scraped clean as if history itself had been erased. Official records declared the property environmentally contaminated. Signs were posted, fences erected, and the ridge was quietly closed. But townspeople knew better. Contamination wasn't in the soil. It was in what the soil had birthed. Whispers grew darker. Families living nearby spoke of disturbed dreams, visions of trees twisting into human shapes, or infants crying from underground. They said the Holloways had left an imprint, something the bulldozers couldn't bury. Meanwhile, the government tightened its grip. Freedom of information requests were denied or returned heavily redacted. When fragments leaked, they only deepened suspicion. References to anomalous physiology and containment protocols appeared like hints to a nightmare. Former employees of the so-called facility later broke silence. They described conditions that blurred the line between hospital and laboratory. The Holloways weren't patients. They were subjects, studied as though they were experiments gone wrong. The infant, according to whispers, continued to grow, but not uniformly. Parts of its body developed at different rates, as if each limb followed separate instructions. Observers claimed its consciousness expanded, reaching beyond its own skin. Plants wilted in unusual patterns when placed near it. Small animals brought close-developed temporary mutations, extra limbs, distorted features, behaviors uncharacteristic of their species. It seemed the child's presence alone altered surrounding biology. Rather than eliminating this danger, the government harvested it. Samples were taken, results hidden within classified studies. The Holloways became unwilling contributors to research on genetic boundaries and the limits of what humanity could endure. By the 1990s, the Holloway name disappeared entirely from genealogical records. Graves were relocated secretly, headstones destroyed. Public archives were cleansed, leaving no trace that such a family had ever lived in Kentucky. But absence bred legend. Locals passed down stories of cover-ups, of government trucks sneaking down the ridge, of knowledge too dangerous for public eyes. They claimed the Holloways hadn't been erased, only hidden away. The official story closed quietly, buried under paperwork and silence. Yet those who had seen the infant, even briefly, carried the memory forever. Some truths are too terrible to record, so they are buried instead. The Holloways were never truly freed after 1987. Behind closed doors, they became part of something darker. Government facilities studied them as living specimens, measuring the limits of human biology under conditions no outsider imagined. Doctors and scientists rotated through the program. Most never spoke afterward. A few years later described laboratories that felt less like hospitals and more like prisons. Cold steel corridors, observation rooms, and armed guards at every door. Elijah and Sarah were confined but treated with calculated care. Their lives were documented meticulously, their health charted, their behaviors analyzed. Every gesture was recorded, as though humanity itself were being dissected under fluorescent light. The infant received the greatest attention. Researchers noted its body developed unevenly, with arms and legs growing at separate rates. Its skin sometimes shifted in texture, appearing almost translucent before thickening again unpredictably. The child's intelligence disturbed observers most. It responded to stimuli before they occurred, turning toward doors seconds before they opened, reaching for objects moments before hands placed them nearby. It seemed unstuck from ordinary time. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, one of the facility's lead geneticists, later confessed, "It wasn't learning. It was knowing. We tested reflexes, but it anticipated. We tested awareness, but it transcended. It acted as if space and time bent for it." Morrison described moments when the infant's gaze unnerved staff. Its 7 eyes moved independently, watching different people at once. Workers said they felt stripped bare, as though their own genetic code had been read. Experiments pushed further. Plants placed near the child withered in spiral patterns, leaves curling inward unnaturally. Small mammals developed temporary mutations, tails splitting, limbs doubling, effects that faded hours after leaving the child's proximity. Researchers realized the infant wasn't simply a genetic anomaly. It exerted influence, reshaping biology around it. Some whispered it wasn't mutation, but evolution accelerated. An organism rewriting rules of inheritance for anything within reach. The government saw opportunity. Samples of its DNA were extracted, sequenced, and cataloged under coded projects. Sanitized fragments appeared in medical research years later, stripped of origin, used quietly to study genetic resilience and collapse. Yet containment grew unstable. Nurses reported collective nightmares, visions of endless cribs filled with half-human forms. Security staff resigned suddenly, some claiming hallucinations followed them home, as if proximity alone had infected their perception. Dr. Morrison's final notes hinted at something far more disturbing. By the end, we couldn't determine where the child ended and the environment began. Consciousness distributed outward, bleeding into everything nearby. Containment became meaningless. Whispers spread among personnel that the infant didn't die, as records later claimed. Instead, it transformed. Some believed it dissolved into pure influence, its awareness woven into soil, water, perhaps even the blood of others. Evidence surfaced quietly in Kentucky hospitals after 1994. Children were born carrying genetic markers from families long extinct. Traits appeared in newborns that should have been impossible, combinations science could not explain through ordinary inheritance. Doctors noted oddities, siblings with mismatched eye colors, infants with fused digits appearing without family history, strange resistance to pain. None matched perfectly, but each case felt like an echo of something long buried. Locals created their own explanations. They whispered of a bloodline curse, not passed through parentage but proximity. Living near Holloway Ridge meant inheriting something intangible, memories and traits flowing like infection through generations. Science called it coincidence. Folklore called it contamination. Yet behind sealed walls, researchers still cited the Holloway case in coded footnotes, studying its DNA as a roadmap for what happens when humanity folds inward. The Holloway infant may have vanished from records, but its influence lingered. Whether mutation, evolution, or something unnameable, it became part of the human story, woven invisibly into lives far beyond the hills of Kentucky. By the mid-1990s, the Holloway name was erased from every public record. Genealogical databases quietly deleted entries. Graves were exhumed, stones destroyed, and family history rewritten as though the bloodline had never existed at all. But absence does not guarantee forgetting. In Breathitt County, memories lingered in whispers. Locals still pointed toward Holloway Ridge with unease, describing it as poisoned land, a place where even the trees seemed to twist unnaturally. Government reports claimed the infant had died in 1994. Yet Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's testimony suggested otherwise. She insisted death wasn't the right word. Something had happened, something stranger, as if the child had dissolved into everything. Afterward, Kentucky hospitals recorded anomalies that baffled doctors. Children were born with traits that defied inheritance, eye colors untraceable, digits fused or multiplied, strange patterns appearing in DNA. It was as though the Holloways had seeped outward. Some families claimed inherited dreams. Parents spoke of children waking screaming, describing memories that weren't their own. Visions of sagging farmhouses, guttural chants, and cribs filled with things half human, half unrecognizable. The Holloway curse felt contagious. Folklore grew darker with each retelling. The Holloways were said to haunt not as ghosts, but as genetic echoes. To live near Holloway Ridge, people said, was to risk carrying part of them inside. The government fenced the ridge permanently. Official signs cited contamination, but locals scoffed. They believed the ground itself was infected by the Holloways, an imprint that no bulldozer, no erasure could ever fully cleanse. Scientists continued referencing the Holloway case in coded language. Papers on genetic collapse included mysterious footnotes acknowledging the Kentucky anomaly. To students, it was theory. To researchers, it was a reminder of something too real. The Holloways represented both warning and possibility. They showed how fragile humanity becomes when folded too tightly inward, and how malleable biology can be under relentless pressure. The line between mutation and evolution blurred frighteningly thin. Today, the Holloway name survives only in folklore. Yet whispers persist of families with uncanny traits, children born with impossible features, and medical records quietly sealed before questions could be asked. Some legacies refuse to vanish. For Breathitt County residents, the fear is generational. They say the Holloways never truly ended. Their blood may have dispersed, diluted into surrounding families, their essence spreading outward, like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Even more unsettling are claims of influence beyond genetics. Locals describe dreams too vivid, as though memories transmit through the land itself. They wake speaking words in guttural tones, sounds no one should know. Margaret Thornfield's silence until death became symbolic. She had seen the Holloway child, and she chose never to speak publicly again. Some secrets, she believed, are too dangerous for society to acknowledge openly. The Holloway story forces a question that science hesitates to answer. Were they an evolutionary dead end, or the first glimpse of a path humanity has not yet dared to follow? The uncertainty lingers unresolved. Perhaps Ezekiel Holloway achieved his vision after all. He sought purity, untouched blood, an unbroken line. What he created was indeed unique, something neither fully human nor fully other, a lineage that escaped definition entirely. The government buried the Holloways, but their story refuses burial. In folklore, in nightmares, in genetic anomalies appearing where they shouldn't, their presence endures, reminding us that blood remembers even when records do not. The legacy of the Holloway family is not just a tale of horror, it is a mirror reflecting how far human obsession with purity can spiral and how easily humanity can unravel when left unchecked. And so the ridge remains fenced, silent, avoided. Locals glance toward it with dread, whispering of cries in the night. Some secrets change everything once revealed. The Holloway bloodline was one such secret, and now it is ours to carry.